everybody to this webinar titled Intellectual Freedom, Censorship, and Confidentiality. I am Mary Ann Morey. I'm the Central District Consultant with the State Library. And with me today is Jay Peterson, our consultant at the main office of the State Library. And Jay is my producer today, so he'll be handling any technical issues we run into, which we hope won't be an issue, but he's my sidekick for the day. Thank you, Jay, for agreeing to be here.
Thank you, Mary Ann. Thanks.
Yeah. This is evidently a popular topic. We had about 80 people registered, and I see about half of you are in the room, so we may have some others joining us as we go along, which is great. And if not, hopefully they'll be able to access the recording, which we are posting or recording right now, and we'll post at a near future date, and that would be a really good session, I might add, for any of your trustees. We do have at least one trustee in the room today. Welcome. I have presented this session before for trustees. I've presented it for the Public Library Management course, the Public Library Support Staff course, and before moving to Iowa, I presented aspects of these topics to education majors, actually student teachers getting ready to go out into the field from one of the local universities in my hometown. So it's kind of an evolving presentation that every time I present it, I go through and tweak it and update it and add just a little bit more. So you can see that our primary focus today is actually intellectual freedom, but censorship and confidentiality fall in with that overarching topic of intellectual freedom, and you'll see how as we move along today. We do have some goals for you today. Hopefully by the time you finish this presentation, you will understand those legal issues that pertain to intellectual freedom, because there are several. And we'll also be examining, I won't ask you to post anything online here unless you really want to, but just examining at least internally our personal beliefs and how those actually affect many of our library decisions. I'm going to ask you to think about your library's policies and processes, procedures for dealing with the issues we'll talk about today. And finally, I will be presenting an actual challenge scenario and some practical information about ways that you can respond to that. So before we move too much further, I do have a poll here, and I'm going to post this and ask you to answer. I hope you're seeing this. Jay, you can let me know if you're seeing this. When you're faced with a challenge at your library, what do you do? And maybe you've never been faced with a challenge at your library. But what are some options for you? Obviously, you can put something on Library Talk. That's a great place to brainstorm with other librarians about what to do. Possibly resort to a collection development policy. Take your coffee break. Probably what you want to do, right? Or just tell the challenger that, you know what, this is crazy that you want to challenge this child's book. This is just a children's book. How can it harm anybody? Just if you don't like it, don't use our library anymore. So what do you do? Looks like we still have a few more people who haven't voted. And right now, looks like a majority of you are saying you would resort to your library's collection development and reconsideration policies. Now, if I were to ask you right now, well, what does your collection development policy actually say? What is your reconsideration policy? Could you tell me? Or do you know where it's readily located so you could grab it in a pinch and show it to perhaps an angry patron who's fussing about a material at your library? I'm giving you some time to type. Lola wholeheartedly says yes, she knows what it says and knows where it is. And Susan's actually had to use hers. And some of you are making reference to some things that I'll talk about here later. I think it's important that all of your staff, assuming you have staff, or perhaps if you're relying on some volunteers in your library, that everybody there needs to know what kind of policies you have in place. And it's likewise important that your trustees know what are our policies about these topics. So, that being said, it's always nice to talk with other librarians about what their experiences are. So yeah, Library Talk could be an interesting place to get some information. As I also noted there, you probably really want to just say, you know what, it's time for my break. I'm going to let somebody else deal with this. But unfortunately, that's not always a possibility, right? Especially if you're a one-person library. So we're talking today about intellectual freedom. And no matter how long or how short you've worked in a library, you surely know by now that libraries are in the business of providing information. But as we're going to be discussing today, sometimes that information gets challenged. And this is the phrase that kind of summarizes why we continue to provide information, even though that information may be viewed as controversial. If I were to ask you to define intellectual freedom, if I were to ask you to explain intellectual freedom to one of your library users or to a new trustee, how would you define intellectual freedom? Looks like several of you are typing. Wait for some answers to pop in here. It's a pretty heavy-duty concept. Wow, a lot of typing going on here. Access any information that somebody's interested in. Right to read whatever you want. Is it just about reading, Terry? And any source, anytime, anywhere. Yeah, Terry, no, you're right. It covers more than just reading, right? Access to information you want to learn about. Aaron, I'm glad to see you mentioning the First Amendment. Did you peek at my slides, Aaron? Because you're talking about some things. You mentioned a couple of things that I'll be covering here today. But this is the definition from the American Library Association, and the highlights and the underlining are mine. As you can see, it's the right of every individual to seek and receive information from all points of view. Interesting that it doesn't say from both sides, because there usually are more than just two sides to any issue. Without restriction, it provides for free access to all expressions of ideas. So those are the primary aspects of intellectual freedom. Now, if I had to summarize intellectual freedom in one word, I would probably say it's balance, and you'll see me refer to this word multiple times today. I believe you've got to have balance in your library collection from typically both sides, but as I mentioned earlier, from all sides. And you've got to balance your own belief system with the information from a system that you may oppose from what you believe is to be right. And this means that you're going to have books about a variety of topics, and some of those topics might be hot topics, and they'll have varying points of view. And it also means you might have some materials on your library shelf that could offend some people, and perhaps even offend you. So lots of things to think about here from a personal level. You've got to remember that you have to respect the varying sides of an issue, as well as the varying sides of a challenge, and we'll talk more about that in just a little bit. Actually, if I had to summarize my entire library career, I would probably say it's balance, if I had to summarize librarianship in one word. And we'll talk more about this as we go along. So one of you mentioned the First Amendment, and that's where I want to start. We have so many rights and freedoms in the U.S. that I think we often take for granted. And because I was in an intellectual freedom class, an entire course about intellectual freedom, and here we are trying to cram it into 1.5 hour webinar, but I took an entire course about intellectual freedom when I was in library school at the University of Illinois. And I had a student in that class who was not American. I'll tell you a little bit more about her in a subsequent slide here. But she was from a country that did not have these rights. Jay, I see Christine can't hear me. Hopefully everyone else is still hearing me. But the First Amendment, the very basic right, says that we have the freedom of speech, the freedom of the press. So those are aspects that are foundational of library services. We're allowed to speak and write and think what we wish, and we have the right to express any opinion we like. It's basically a marketplace of ideas. So in a library, This means that to uphold the First Amendment, we've got to allow for freedom of speech and freedom of expression, and likewise freedom from oppression of thoughts and ideas, and take seriously our role in the community as a place for people to come and read differing opinions from their own and to find information without bias. Oh yes, Anne, that's a quote that I'll share in another slide here. That's a pretty famous quote. Tied in with the First Amendment is the Fourth Amendment, and that one allows for the right to privacy. So you have rights to your own papers, your own house. The government has to issue a warrant to go into your house. This right to privacy has also been extended to what you read or access in a library. So nobody needs to know what you've read or what your own letters say, and the government has to issue warrants to see those things in pursuit of a case. Okay? So a lot of what we'll be talking about today, keep in mind, it's based upon these two amendments, the First Amendment and the Fourth Amendment. The American Library Association, based upon the First Amendment and the Fourth Amendment, developed what's known as the Library Bill of Rights. And it's not really a legal document, but it's still an important document that espouses the ethics of librarianship and intellectual freedom. It has been vetted by attorneys, and it's based upon those First and Fourth Amendments that we just viewed. So if anybody ever tells you, wow, the Library Bill of Rights, that's not a legal thing, we don't have to abide by that, I would just advise such people that these have been vetted by attorneys, big city attorneys who know their stuff about what's allowed and what's not, and it's worth a library to behoove what is stated in the Library Bill of Rights. And this Library Bill of Rights consists of 6 points, so let me just look at these in the next couple slides here. The first one, material should not be excluded because of the origin, background, or views. Not be excluded. The second one, all points of view on current and historical issues. Now that's a tough one if you're a small library and you have limited funds and limited shelving, right? That can be tough. Well, how on earth can I possibly find all points of view? Well, I think there again you have to use balance. Somebody mentioned, well, if I order a book from one leaning side political aspect, I need to order another book that's from the opposite political side. So I'm trying to keep up with the chat, so Jay, let me know. Somebody asked about the Patriot Act and books about going to heaven is the book of fraud. And one of my library colleagues in another state asked about, oh, I can't remember the author's name, but he had a lot of home remedy ideas, and it was later proven that they were just, as you said, malarkey. And then one of the authors, well, several actually in recent times, who have previously written nonfiction and later admitted, oh, you know, I kind of just lied about everything. What do you do with these books? And I think you still can make those kinds of books available, because let people decide on their own what they think of it. And those books are often topics in the news or on bestseller lists, so you want people to be able to have access to information even if you don't agree with it or other people think it's fraudulent or you know, not exactly what it's supposed to be. You can still make those things available. Doesn't mean you have to have every single thing available, as we just mentioned, because you're limited on space and budget. But go back to that word I mentioned earlier, balance. Libraries should challenge censorship. We should try to stand up for it. Point 4 in the Library Bill of Rights says we need to cooperate with all persons and groups that are concerned about resisting abridgment of free expression, free access to ideas. And this one is interesting because it says a person's right to use a library should not be denied or abridged because of origin, age, background, and views. And notice that age is in there. I'll point this out again later. Point 6 deals with a totally different aspect, but we're talking about access, right? And this one kind of takes the whole Library Bill of Rights away from what we traditionally think of, which would be books, or maybe we kind of expand that to mean the internet. But this one talks about meeting spaces. So not only do you need to think about your collection development policy, but also your meeting room policy when it comes to intellectual freedom and use of the library. So this Library Bill of Rights was first adopted by ALA in 1939. And those of you who are history buffs may recall what was happening in 1939. And I think that's why the American Library Association thought it was important to implement this. What was happening in 1939? Some of you answer that question. You didn't know this was going to be a history quiz. Yeah, World War II was starting, and Germany had invaded Poland, and Germany was burning books. So the American Library Association said, we don't want that happening here, so we're going to adopt this Library Bill of Rights. Now, if you've been reading the small print on this slide, then you will see that this Library Bill of Rights was modeled after a similar statement that was written by this person, Forrest Spaulding, who happened to be the library director at the Des Moines Public Library. So Iowa has a claim to fame when it comes to the Library Bill of Rights. It's kind of cool, huh? I want to talk about personal biases. And you might all say, I'm not biased, but I bet you have a favorite color. I bet you have a favorite style of music. I bet you have a favorite actor or actress. I bet you have favorite types of books you like to read, favorite genre, favorite author, right? So those can all become biases, whether we realize it or not. Now let me share a story with you. When I started as a library director, I used to be a library director at a library here in Iowa, and when I started there, the DVD collection was kind of pitiful. It wasn't very large, wasn't particularly good. It was based predominantly upon donations, so it was sort of a hodgepodge, a lot of gaps in it. And I guess I could have taken my personal bias, because I really don't like movies that much. I don't watch them. I don't have time for them. So maybe that was a bias, and I could have thought, well, other people don't need these movies either. They shouldn't be watching them. It's just a time waster. Another aspect, I happen to, when I do watch movies, prefer foreign films and indie films. So was that a bias? In fact, I started to order for the DVD collection a few films that actually were indie films and foreign language films. Was I allowing my bias to influence what I was ordering for the library? Well, if you hear it presented like that, you're probably thinking, well, yeah, Marianne, you were kind of biased to do that. But if I look at the bigger picture and realize we had gaps in that DVD collection, as I said, part of those gaps were the fact that we did not have any foreign films, and 42 languages were being spoken in the local school. So I did start to buy some indie and foreign films, and I got compliments on that. People started checking them out and saying, wow, we really like these additions to the DVD collection. So we eventually got better funding, and we were able to buy additional films, not just the indie and the foreign language, but kind of fill in a lot of gaps that existed there. But you can see how if we don't examine the bigger picture, sometimes our personal biases could influence us. Here's this cartoon where this person is telling this child it's reading and it's how people install new software into their brains. I have actually heard librarians be somewhat biased in this regard, that they think books are the only thing the library should carry, and they think books are what people should check out. I cannot tell you, and you don't have to raise your hand if you've ever said this, but I cannot tell you how many times I've heard librarians say, all people want these days are DVDs. Nobody reads anymore. They need to be reading more. Is that a bias? Could it be interpreted as a bias? Well, it's possible. So, what kinds of materials have you had personal conflict with maintaining in your library? And more important, how have you overcome that situation? What do you have in your library that maybe you're just not really comfortable with? Erotica, yeah, Marlis, a lot of people will admit that I really don't like having people check this stuff out because I know it's not maybe the best literature that they could be reading. Or maybe you see young people checking it out. Anybody else? Looks like several of you are typing. Bill O'Reilly. Alt-right stuff. Oh yes, hiding that infamous Sports Illustrated swimsuit issue. Harlequins, yeah. Not so much maybe that they're risque, because I don't know that they're as risque as a lot of more the erotica stuff nowadays, but maybe just because they're not particularly well written. The chicken soup books, yeah. Yeah, so there are a lot of things. Interesting, most of you are mentioning books, actually. Well, except for the swimsuit issue of the magazine. So nobody really answered, how have you overcome the situation? What have you done? Did you get rid of the books? Did you just not order those kinds of materials? Debbie says she bites her tongue. Putting things out of the main eye, is that a form of censorship? Okay, reducing the number of subscriptions to a particular type of book. I don't know that that's necessarily censorship if you need to look at your budgetary aspects, right? And space constraints. Zach says just suck it up and let people read what they want. Kirk adds the same thing. As a friend of mine likes to say, suck it up, buttercup, right? Ah, Anne, interesting. You look like you were going to get a challenge, but it dropped. We'll mention aspects of that later. Jenny, I'm glad to see you've had good conversations with patrons about their concerns. And yeah, I think we have to remember that when people do challenge materials, it is a concern. More about that as we talk about censorship here. So how would you define censorship? How would you define censorship? Christine, that's so true. If you realize something may not be appropriate for your community, or you just don't have the budget or the shelf space to have everything, you can consider interlibrary loan and let your patrons know about that as an option. So Jenny, you're saying hiding a magazine behind another one could be a form of censorship? Yeah, it looks like a lot of you are mentioning all different ways that censorship can happen. This is a screenshot, again, from the American Library Association's website regarding intellectual freedom and censorship. You may not be able to read the details here, but hopefully you can see the giant purple print. That shows the topics that are discussed on this site. And the last one there, you can see the relationship between censorship and intellectual freedom. And according to ALA, censorship is the suppression of ideas and information that certain persons, whether those are individuals, groups, or government officials, find objectionable or dangerous. It is no more complicated than someone saying, don't let anyone read this book or buy that magazine or view that film because I object to it. So I mentioned to you earlier that I took that course, that entire course about intellectual freedom at the University of Illinois. And I had a rather outspoken classmate in that course. He was, well, to put it politely, he was downright obnoxious with his comments. And I found it really interesting that he was in this course about intellectual freedom and censorship, that he was so opposed to censorship that without realizing it, he wanted to censor the would-be censor's comments. Does that make sense? He wanted to censor what a would-be censor wanted to say. So, in reality, he was practicing censorship. He was doing exactly what he was opposed to. And I think we need to be reminded about what ALA has to say about censorship, because under this section, this one I have highlighted here with the arrow about the relationship between censorship and intellectual freedom, it says this: in expressing their opinions and concerns, would-be censors are exercising the same rights librarians seek to protect when they confront censorship. In making their criticisms known, people who object to certain ideas are exercising the same rights as those who created and disseminated the material to which they object. So their right to voice opinions and try to persuade others to adopt those opinions is protected, only if the rights of persons to express ideas they despise are also protected. So it kind of goes both ways. And you can see that that's the last statement there on the slide. The rights of both sides must be protected or neither will survive. So, interesting, right? So let's look at this question. A library refuses to purchase a wildly popular item because the director or the board or the collection development librarian or what have you thinks the item is not appropriate. Is this an act of censorship? You're all saying yes. But what about, well, let's go back to your collection development policies. You earlier all said, yeah, we know what it says. How many of your collection development policies say this library does not collect textbooks? Are you censoring textbooks because you don't purchase them? I'm waiting for some people to type here. While you're typing, I'll move on. This is one that surely comes to mind because it's still fairly recent that libraries dealt with this, to buy or not to buy, 50 Shades of Grey. When this book came out, it made all the news because libraries were debating this, to buy or not to buy. And there was one story about a library, I think it was in Florida, that was accused of censorship because they didn't buy this book. Well, do you know why they didn't buy this book? And do you know why a lot of libraries had trouble determining whether or not to buy it? It was because their collection development policy said, we do not purchase erotica. And maybe some of your collection development policies say this. Now, I'm not saying that's wrong. You need to have guidelines as to how you're going to budget your money, right? And so a lot of libraries had in their collection development policies, we will not purchase erotica. Well, do you know what one of the approved subject heading classifications for this book was? Erotica fiction. And so because of that, they looked at that and says, well, this doesn't match our collection development policy. Just like for a lot of libraries, textbooks do not match the public library's collection development policy. So, wow, censorship's not so easy to determine anymore, right? Just because you don't buy something may not mean it's censorship. But we have to be careful and examine our motives and our collection development policies to kind of test them, if you will, against aspects of censorship. Maybe some of you have previously seen this cartoon. This is what we had to take out of the library that was, you could fill in the blank with anything you wanted. Too religious or not religious enough. Too conservative, not conservative enough. Too much this, not enough that. This is what we had to take out, and before you know it, you have nothing left on the shelves, right? Yeah, now Merle Lee, you're offering, going back to my textbook suggestion there, you're saying we're not an academic library. We're not a school library. We're not going to purchase the textbooks. One, they're very, very pricey. And you're right, they go out of date very quickly because schools typically replace textbooks every, 5 years, I think it is. So there are good reasons why libraries may have that in their collection development policy. It doesn't mean they're censoring. It means they have to draw a line somewhere and realize we cannot be a library for everybody. We're a public library. We're not an academic library. We're not a research library. We're not an archival library. So we have to think about what we're going to purchase and what we're going to retain on our shelves, right? Plus, let's face it, budgets often dictate what we can or can't buy. This is the quote that somebody was referring to previously that her director has said. This quote is attributed to Joe Goodwin, and I have not been able to figure out who Joe Goodwin is. If any of you know, I would love knowing who this person is. But the quote is, "A truly great library contains something in it to offend everyone." So it's kind of a reminder to us that our duty, if you will, as public librarians is to be offensive. And I say that kind of tongue-in-cheek. But truly, if your library doesn't have something that some people think is offensive, then maybe you don't have a very balanced collection, right? Something to think about, definitely. So before we go too much farther, I want to examine these two concepts, challenged versus banned. A challenge is an attempt to remove library material or restrict the use of it. Banning actually means the complete removal of that item from the library. Banning can result from a challenge, and challenges do not simply involve a person expressing a point of view. They are actually an attempt to remove the material. So you may have somebody complain about a particular item in your book, but that may not be a challenge. The challenge is when they formally say, "I would like to see this removed or restricted." So just complaining about something is not a challenge. And likewise, having a challenge does not always mean that the item is going to be banned. Now, the reason I talk about these and want to differentiate between the two is because of that course I took that I mentioned twice now, the Intellectual Freedom course at the University of Illinois. One of the other students in that course was from China. And she made a comment in that class which so touched me that I haven't forgotten it. She was quite emotional, I guess, when she made this statement. She said, "I cannot understand why Americans talk about book banning." She said, "In America, if a book is taken out of a library, it's still available in another library or a bookstore, or you can order it online." She said, "The book is still available." She said, "In my country, when a book is banned, it is gone. You cannot find it. You cannot access it. And if you happen to have a copy of it, you are in big trouble." That was powerful. So I think we need to remember how fortunate we are here in America that we do have challenges, but thankfully we don't really have banning. So let's look at some books that have been challenged. Are you surprised by any of the titles on this? This is just a drop in the bucket list of titles. Jennifer, you say you're surprised, and Christine too. What surprises you about what you're seeing on this page of challenged books? The Little House. Yeah, that always shocks people. And when I taught this topic to the school teachers or the prospective school teachers from the local university I mentioned earlier, that was a big surprise for them. And Debbie, you are right. It has been challenged in the past because of its depiction of Native Americans. Christine, you say you didn't expect people to take offense to a child's book. I would dare to say that the majority of books that get challenged each year are children's books. Probably an overwhelming majority of them are children's books. So in looking at these titles here, just realize that cultural attitudes change and community morality changes and shifts with the times. And books that today don't seem very risky may have been very controversial at the time they were published. So works like Huckleberry Finn and Uncle Tom's Cabin were famously banned at the time of their release because of their view on civil rights, but they're now considered classic works. And interestingly enough, The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, which is considered a classic, is still regularly on the banned books list because of its language concerning certain people groups. But all of these books on the slide have been challenged at one point in time or another, and some of them have been changed or challenged at more than just one point. And yes, some of you are discussing the fact that books have talking animals, and that has been a reason why some books have been challenged. Take a look at this. Now, Christine, you're saying, well, I've never seen a child's book that offended me. So I think most of us, when we think of children's books, we think of the very innocent Charlotte's Web. Who could object to that? That's my favorite as a child, right? Hop on Pop, Dr. Seuss. Who could offend it to Hop on Pop? This story, this is for real, people. I didn't make this up. Censorship attempts just run the gamut. With challenges to the erotica and challenges to graphic novels, to political, religious, but very often, as I said, children's books. This date on this article from out of Toronto was May 5th of 2014, but I actually saw this in the news a couple of days before that, but it happened around 2014. And so this was, let me see here, I want to read this to you. The Dr. Seuss book that's intended to teach phonics to young children was challenged, quote, because it encourages children to use violence against their fathers. The user asked the library not only to remove the book, but also to issue an apology to fathers in the GTA, I think that's in that vicinity, and pay damages. So, in response, the library pointed out that the book had been around for 50 years and that children are actually told not to hop on pops, and hop on pop remains in the library. So, oh, let's see. Merle, the dad in this book was shaped like your dad. That's funny. And Rosalind, you are right that we should be concerned about challenges, and I certainly didn't mean earlier in my comments that we shouldn't be concerned about challenges, but I think it's good for us to remember the differences between challenges and bans. More on that in a moment. So. I mentioned earlier your collection development policy and its importance, and I hope that after this session you will go back and look at your collection development policy, maybe in a new light, and that you will encourage your trustees to go back and look at their the collection development policy, because remember, it's the trustees who pass your policies. And just make sure you've got a lot of the things that we are talking about today. Your collection development policy, that's your selection policy, helping you decide, what am I going to buy? The apples or the pears, as you see in the picture here. But it should discuss the purpose, the who, the how, and the what. The purpose is kind of going to be a mission statement about your collection. What is the purpose of your collection? Is it to inform, to entertain, or educate? And it's a good place to mention something about intellectual freedom, the fact that you will have all points of view, a broad range of topics, etc. A lot of libraries will include that freedom to read statement as part of their collection development policy. The policy should include the who. Who is responsible for building your library's collection? Usually it's the director that's ultimately responsible, or any such people that the director may designate. In larger libraries, they might have a designated librarian in charge of acquisitions, maybe a collection development manager or something to that effect. How, that is how items are determined for suitability in the collection. And usually this is done through the use of professional reviews or aspects of the item keeping in line with the library's overall mission and purpose. And as I said earlier, budget plays a key role in what you're going to get and how you're going to develop the collection. And then the what is what goes into your collection. Do you collect books, magazines, newspapers, movies, music, electronic resources? Do you purchase cake pans, puzzles, toys, costumes? What is in your collection? So having these kinds of details spelled out in your collection development policy can hopefully prevent a lot of frustration and confusion on your part, as well as the part of your staff and on the part of the public. And by the way, I just want to say I am thrilled that you're all typing so much in the chat box. This is what I love in a webinar. So you're sharing your thoughts and ideas. If I'm missing any questions, Jay, I'm going to count on you to bring those to my attention at some point in time. And I apologize, I can't completely keep up with all of the conversations here, but please keep your comments coming. That's great. Just a reminder about your collection development policy. As I said earlier, your trustees adopt it, and you do have to have a collection development policy as part of your accreditation requirements, and also as part of your accreditation requirements for your library. And keep in mind, accreditation is how you get state funding. Your library's policies have to be reviewed every 3 years. So if you haven't looked at your collection development policy for a while and you haven't reviewed it with your board, now might be a good time to do that. So let's delve in a little bit deeper to collection development policies. Selection, withdrawals, reconsiderations, those all need to be spelled out in your collection development policy. And by the way, if you're new to librarianship, reconsideration, that's the fancy word, the library terminology word for a challenge. So let's see, I'm going to move on here and let's just look at a sample. This is one from Waukee Public Library here in Iowa. And I've often used Waukee as an example, and I'm going to do so again today. So their collection development policy is further divided into subsections, and here's the first part. It's simply titled Collection Development Policy. You can see that they begin right up front with this purpose. Let me get my handy-dandy little arrow here. This purpose, what is their purpose? Well, to follow their mission. The purpose of the policy is to guide librarians in what they're going to select. And it's also to let the public know about how they are making selections. They've also included principles of collection development, and they refer to the fact that the library follows the library's Bill of Rights. Let's see here. Here you can see they go on, here's where they mention the Library Bill of Rights from the American Library Association. Their policy goes on to dictate the responsibility for selection, the fact that it is vested under the library director and any members of the library staff that the director appoints. They mention aspects of the library board of trustees as a part of it. They also point out that patrons are an important part of selection because the library did take seriously all of the recommendations that they got for purchase. And I hope your libraries do that too. And then they come on out with the rest of this portion of the policy that's devoted to the big section about criteria. What criteria do they use? Well, let's look here. Here's what they use. Current and anticipated needs, the accuracy of the content, timeliness, who wrote it, and what is that person's qualification. Evaluations, basically that's reviews, professional reviews. And you know those are professional reviews because you can see down here what they were using as their selection tools. How does this item contribute to the diversity or breadth of the overall library's collection? Inclusion of the title in standard bibliographies, quality, affordability, and support of the library's mission and roles. These are pretty good criteria for collection development. One thing I will point out is that this collection development policy, I think is very good, but it's probably up for a review and maybe an update. I don't see anything in it that talks about ebooks. So that's something to think about for your collection development policy. Do you mention ebooks? And I know a lot of you probably have added those to your collection through the Bridges collection, the Bridges Consortium. Get rid of my arrow here. This is the collection development policy from Waverly, and you can see that they have actually included, and I know Waukee did too, it was just in a different section, but Waverly has included it specifically in their table of contents within their collection development policy, these documents, the Library Bill of Rights, freedom to read, freedom to view statements, and then their statement of concern about a library resource. That's their reconsideration policy. Something that I would encourage all of you to have in your collection development policy is something about gifts. If not as part of collection development as maybe a separate policy, but you need something about gifts. How many of you have had books donated to the library and they just are not anything at all that you would want to add, either because of the condition or the age or the authorship? And likewise, how many of you have books in your collection that were given as gifts and suddenly somebody at the library says, oh, we can't get rid of that because that was donated as a memorial 28 years ago. See, it still has the label in the front. You can't get rid of it. You need a gift policy, but contact me after this webinar. We'll talk about that, okay? Yeah, gifts and weeding, Christine. You definitely want something about that in your collection development policy. So here's more from Waukee about their policy, talking about how they will get rid of things. You just mentioned weeding, so here we go. How do we decide what we're going to take off the shelf? Because that's just as important as what you're going to add. I know of libraries where a new employee comes in, maybe a new director comes in, and I'm just looking at your comments here. If you won't lick it, we won't take it. And wow, that's interesting. But I know of some librarians who take over and they start to pull a lot of things off the shelf, things they maybe don't agree with. That's an aspect of censorship too, that, oh, well, you know what, I don't approve of this book, so I'm just going to weed it because I'm doing this major weeding project, and I'll just pull it out along with these other books, even though it's very popular and people are checking it out. But I don't approve of it, so I'm going to get rid of it. That's censorship too. So you need to be careful, and you need to have some policies in place about why you weed and what you weed. So, Jay, I think this is actually one of your slides from PLM class. Intellectual freedom. I'm not going to ask you to answer all of these, but just some questions for you to think about. Do you have anything posted at your library that addresses intellectual freedom? That could be a good idea, to post something near the front door or near the circulation desk about intellectual freedom. Do you think your library supports the freedom to read, or maybe you have something that somebody at your library who maybe isn't quite there? I once worked with an employee in a library who believed the library should not purchase religious fiction, inspirational fiction, because he said, well, that's religious, and I don't think public dollars should be used to buy religious books. So he didn't think the library should have anything religious related. So also known as no Amish books. Was that supporting the freedom to read? And think about what kinds of items are in your library that may be offensive, not just to you, but maybe to some of your patrons. So just some things for you to think about. Confidentiality. Let's move on. We have a lot of ground to cover yet. Confidentiality includes keeping what a patron reads private, keeping what a patron asks about as a reference question private, and keeping what a patron accesses on the internet private. And you should follow policies and procedures to keep all of these kinds of records private and not do anything to reveal any of these records to anybody else. And we're going to look in just a moment at some ways that libraries sometimes unintentionally reveal these aspects, that they violate privacy. So keep in mind that people are free to read whatever they wish, and no attempt should be made to limit patron access to materials in your library, even though you might personally find the items offensive. As a reminder, Iowa has a code, Chapter 22.2 and 22.7, that says the following records shall be kept confidential: the records of the library, which by themselves or when examined with other public library or public records would reveal the identity of the library patron. This is law. This is law, and we're going to talk about your topic in just a little bit. Toward the end of the session, we'll talk about that. So keep in mind, library records are confidential records because of Iowa code, as well as the ethics of librarianship. You should only give up information that we've discussed in that last slide pursuant to court order, pursuant to a case by court order. And state law is backing up what federal law says, that library records are private. And you can see here the two times that a patron's records may be open. One is with a court order, and two is if the director releases that information. So the director has a lot of power in this regard, because by law, you can see that second bullet point there, the lawful custodian is interpreted to be the library director. So keep in mind that the director acts under the jurisdiction of the board. So ultimately, I would say it's the board who has that authority. But the keeper of the records, the lawful custodian of the records, is the library director. Pretty tall order. This is a page from our state library website, and this is the section of a sample that deals with the fact that the library will not reveal the identities of individual users nor reveal the information sources or services they consult unless required by law. This is a sample confidentiality policy that we have on our website. So those of you that said, wow, we need to really go through and look at our policies, maybe update them, my board hasn't done that for a while, this is a sample on our library page, and you can see up here the breadcrumbs from it. Go to our website, click the For Libraries tab, and get to the letters K through P. You want letter P for policies, and within that is confidentiality. You can also see here this red mark underneath the arrow that says confidentiality includes database search records, reference interviews, interlibrary loan records, computer use records, and all other personally identifiable uses of library materials, facilities, or services. And here is further information from our state library website. This includes procedures for confidentiality occurrences. That is, what do you do when the local police officer shows up and says he wants to know what Susie Jackson checked out on her library card recently? And it can be required by law if they have that warrant. And when could it be required by law? I'm not an attorney or a police officer, so I'm not going to attempt to answer that, but I'm sure there are cases of maybe let's say suspects of child abuse or child pornography or something like that. But anyway, not going to get into that too much here.
Judy, see a question from Judy.
Judy?
Yeah, that one's tough.
Yeah, I just see that now. That is tough. Judy, I'm going to answer that with another situation that a public library management student discussed. The librarian had a police officer come in and say, we want to know if young Jennifer, age 13, was in the library on the computer. Should the librarian divulge that information? Well, based upon what we're discussing here and the ethics of librarianship, no, you should not divulge that. The police officer went on to say she's missing, and we have reason to believe that she has left and gone with somebody she met online, and we think she is in danger. Do you release that information? Wow. Puts a whole new subject matter on it, doesn't it? Because what librarian doesn't want to help protect a young girl who may be in danger? So if you go back to that one slide that we saw earlier, let me just back up a moment here. The lawful custodian of records is the library director. And the library director does have that authority to release records. But Anne, no, they didn't have a warrant. So I would say that most of us probably would not release that information. I don't remember what the librarian did, but that just is one example that shows you how tricky things can be. Now, Judy, in your situation, somebody's checking out a book on suicide or abortion. You know, a young person is checking out a book on abortion or suicide or something like that. As Diane mentioned, they quite possibly are doing a report for school. If I did see a young person, and in a lot of your smaller libraries, you know these students, and I saw them checking out something like that, I might just keep an extra eye on the person, just befriend them, say hi to them, welcome them, and you don't know. Don't jump to conclusions, I guess, is the ultimate. Yeah, Vicki, true. So let's look at some ways that librarians sometimes inadvertently violate confidentiality. And the first one here is with date due receipts or the pockets in the back that has a person's name on it. This is a picture here of a date due receipt that shows a person's name. Does anybody at any of your libraries have this policy? One of the libraries where I worked did, and boy, I advocated to get that rule changed in a hurry, because anybody could pick this up, and as you know, a lot of people leave their receipts in their books and they end up back on the shelf with these, and so anybody could read those. So if your names, your patron names, are on your receipts, there is a way to get rid of that. Talk to your automation vendor about it and get those off of there. Just having the barcode is not an issue, but with the name, yeah, that's a problem. What about computer sign-in sheets? A lot of smaller libraries do not have computer time management systems, and so they rely on sign-up sheets at the front of the library, at the front desk, where people put their name and what time they arrived and what time they checked out. And the next person comes in and can look at the names above theirs and say, oh, Tim Jackson was on the computer here at 10:40 today. He called in sick to work today. What was he doing at the library on the computer? That's a violation of patron privacy. So find a way to modify your computer sign-in sheets. Christine is saying she keeps hers behind the desk, or use a patron number, not a name. It's another good way that Rhonda's mentioning. Yeah. What about this one, the hold shelf? I just went to one of the libraries here in the metro area to pick up my hold the other day, and this library has their holds on open shelving, so anybody can go up and grab their holds. Well, yeah, they kind of sort of describe or hide the name of the person. They only had the first 3 letters of my name. But you want to be careful if you have a hold shelf that has a person's name on it. And even if you cover up the name, anybody could take the rubber band off or peel the tape or however you're hiding it and find out what it is. So be careful if your hold shelf is out in the public area. Telephone notices. You work in a library, maybe a small one or maybe even a mid-sized one that's an open floor plan, and you make a phone call and you say, this is the so-and-so library calling for Tim Jackson, and the book you ordered about Am I Gay and Self-Love, that's available for pickup now, or it's overdue and we need you to return it. Wow, violation of confidentiality if there are other people in the library and you're making those phone calls where those other patrons can hear that. So one thing I used to tell my staff is when they made those telephone calls, you would say, this is the so-and-so library calling for Tim. You only say the first name, and the items you requested are available for hold, or I'm calling about the overdue books you have. Please contact us so we can make arrangements to have those books returned. So you don't mention the full name and you don't mention exactly what it is they have checked out. Tied along with that, one of you said you send out letters. Snail mail notices. I have known of libraries that instead of sending letters like Terry's library does, they send out postcards. Postcards have the person's name and it lists the books that are overdue, and so that can be a violation of confidentiality and privacy. So if you're sending a letter and it's in an envelope, sealed envelope, that's okay, but be careful if you're using postcards to be able to save postage. This is the big one. What does Billy have checked out? The parent comes in and wants to know what the kid has checked out. We will talk about this in more detail in just a moment. Checkout histories. If your automation system keeps track of a patron's checkout histories, I strongly encourage you to disable that feature. Yes, I know the patrons love it because they want to know, have I read this book before? But let's say you do get a warrant and you're asked to turn over patron records. You can honestly say, I don't know what the person has checked out. So you can disable that. It's not searchable. Even saying we don't know is not enough. I would make it disabled so that nobody, even with a warrant, can get in there and see what patrons have checked out. Your screen monitors, the screens of your monitors at your front desk. You pull up a patron's name and they've asked, maybe they've asked about a particular book that they're interested in, and you've got their name pulled up because you were checking books out to them in the middle of checking out their books. They say, oh, by the way, do you have the such and such book? And you go, oh, yeah, it's on display over here. So you and the patron get up and you walk over to wherever that book is located, and meanwhile, you've left that customer, that patron's information on the screen where somebody else can come up and take a sneak peek at it. That can be problematic. I've seen that in libraries. So be careful. If you're getting up away from your desk, clear the screen of any patron name that you may have on there. Patron privacy, ethics, and the use of volunteers. If you are using volunteers in your library on a regular basis, you need to make sure they are well-versed and well-trained in these topics we're talking about today, that they know they are not to discuss who came into the library and who checked out what. So let's move along a little faster here. I see the clock ticking away from us. I said we'd delve into this a little bit more in detail, the whole confidentiality aspect between parents and children. Yeah, and that has caused a lot of problems in libraries because after all, it's my kid, right? So, can parents see what their children's library records say to determine whether or not they have an overdue? And is it okay for you to tell a library patron all the books their 14-year-old child has checked out if they ask? Well, it's at the discretion of the library director, and let's hope that your library director is well-versed and trained in intellectual freedom. Pages 40 and 41 of the trustees handbook has a lot of good information on this. So I would encourage you to look at that. That's readily available on our website under letter T for trustees. There is something we have to discuss when we talk about this whole topic of parents and children's and the library things. And that's this term in loco parentis. It's a Latin legal phrase that means in the place of the parent. Libraries do not act in the place of the parent in loco parentis. And Rhonda, that's a very good question. I'll get to that in a moment. Remind me if I forget. So in other words, librarians are not supposed to have to be the ones to monitor what a child checks out. It's not our place or our purpose to tell a child, oh, you can't check out that movie because it's not good for you, or you're too little to watch that kind of stuff, or I don't think your mom and dad would like that. That is not our purpose. That is not our place to do that. So if a parent complains that the child has checked out something that the parent doesn't like, whose fault is that? It's the parent's fault. The parent needs to come into the library with the child. So in a webinar that our state law librarian, Mandy Easter, and I recently presented, we talked more about this, and I'm not going to try to get into this topic a whole lot because it's a pretty big subject. I will cover enough to give you information, but I would refer you to the webinar that Mandy and I did. It's titled Problem Parents, Unattended Children, and Disruptive Patrons. I've got a slide about it here in just a minute. But we cover this topic of children's library cards extensively. But I will just tell you what Mandy says. In loco parentis means in the place of a parent or acting as the temporary guardian of a child, taking on all or some of the responsibilities of a parent. So one of the reasons that this whole concept between parents and their children's library records becomes problematic is that for most of your libraries, a child cannot get a library card without the parent signing for it. So the parent signs and provides accountability of those library materials that the child checks out, yet the child has no right to know what the child has actually checked out, right? Glancing here at the chat. Oh, wow, yeah. Wow, it's interesting, Julian. You are lucky that the community defended the library. Yeah. So, the interesting thing about this is that, like Ann is saying, at her library, if they're 5th grade and older, they can get their own card. So here's what Mandy has to say about this from that webinar I mentioned. This is a quote from Mandy. Parents sign for a child's library card because the registration procedure represents a legally binding contract between the library and the private citizen who plans to borrow the city's property, or library materials in this case. The law of contracts says that contracting with a minor is risky, since a legal defense to a minor's breach of contract is that the contractor was a minor. So, those of you that do allow, and these are my words, those of you that do allow a minor to get a library card without parental signature, just realize you are at risk for financial aspects because legally you can't demand that that child pay for any materials he or she loses or damages. So here's from Mandy that she goes on. She says, conventional wisdom says it's best to contract only with adults. Since the law holds parents responsible to an extent for the acts of their children, they can be forced to pay their kids overdue fines, fees, and the cost of lost or damaged items. If parents did not sign their children's registration cards, it might be difficult to recover any costs from the minors themselves, depending on the circumstances. And she goes on then to talk about what you could do, maybe to have the teen volunteer to help pay for those things. But she says experts agree that alienating preteens and teens from libraries has long-term effects on both the teens and the libraries, and they recommend that librarians and trustees take precautions to prevent that from happening. So there is more information about that on that webinar that Mandy and I discussed. But I just want to remind you back to that Library Bill of Rights that a person's right to use a library should not be denied because of age. So this goes back to, well, yeah, we're not going to prevent a young child from checking out anything in the library just because they're too young. Obviously, though, there is a huge difference between a parent asking about their 3-year-old child's library records and their 13-year-old child's records. So here's some practical ways that some libraries have dealt with children's records. Number one, you want to make sure that your library card applications clearly state that the library will remain confidential and that the library cannot share the child's records with the parents. And since the parents are signing these applications, you point out that clause clearly to the parent. And number two, if the child is old enough to get to the library alone, such as by walking or riding a bicycle, then that child is old enough to warrant complete confidentiality. A toddler, on the other hand, obviously needs a parent or adult to help him get there to the library. Number three, if your library is automated and patrons can access their accounts online, I would encourage you to tell the patron or the parent, all you need to do is get Tommy's library card, sit down with the child and access the account together online. Let me show you how to do that, and you can see what he has checked out. Another option is to tell the parent, well, if you will bring Tommy here, I can tell him what he has checked out on his account. The other thing you can do is print out a receipt of the child's checkouts, put it in a sealed envelope, and mail it to the home to the attention of the child. And then if the parent opens it, that's the parent's issue, right? ALA does have a privacy toolkit that's available. It's a privacy audit that you can run at your library to determine the level of privacy you're maintaining. You can just do a generic online search for ALA privacy toolkit or privacy audit and it should come up. I'm not sharing the link because ALA is notorious for changing their URLs. This is the webinar that Mandy and I presented back on January 5th of this year. It is currently available as an archive on our state library website under the archived webinars, which is part of the continuing ed page. So I would encourage you to watch this for additional information about the whole parent-child relationship when it comes to library cards and privacy of minors' records. So we already talked about the difference between challenged and banned. So keep this in mind as we go to the next slides here. ALA every year has a banned books week. It's always held in the last week of September. And the current dates for 2017 are September 24th through the 30th. So this is something you may want to mark on your calendar and do something special. A lot of libraries set up displays or they highlight books that have made the hit list. And titles include everything from the Bible to Harry Potter. So let me just do a whirlwind here of some Iowa libraries that have set up Banned Books Week displays. This first one is coming out of Storm Lake Public Library. Anybody here from Storm Lake? I haven't really checked the audience attendance here. But this display, I think, had peepholes in it, so you could look inside to see what the banned books were. And you can see it's quite eye-catching with all the cautionary tape and the fire surrounding it. Zach, this is where you live, so there you go. Yeah, it is kind of a cool display. This one is from Iowa City Public Library. I really like this one just because it's so nifty with that circular display, but that wasn't what they did. I think they already owned this funky display area, which is kind of cool, but they decorated it and made it, again, very eye-catching. This I thought was very creative. This came out of Spirit Lake. Even the library statues are reading banned books. So kind of a fun way to draw attention to the fact that a lot of books get challenged every year. And if you don't have fancy displays and much space, just take a corner, take a table, take a book cart, and put a very simple display on it. This came out of Donaldson Public Library. And they put a sign up that just says, most frequently challenged books. You can see Gone with the Wind is on here. Not what you usually think of as a challenged book, right? So this is a very basic one. Actually listing the reason why, like Marla says, that can be a pretty good reason. Like some of you were discussing earlier, oh, this one was challenged because it has talking animals in it. There are so many challenge books each year that there are books published called the hit list, and you can access these. The most frequently challenged books in general are those just for children or those just for teens. So you could probably do an interlibrary loan search for these and probably find some. I know Zach is in the audience, and I'm going to do a shout out to him. Zach is the director at Cherokee, and he just presented a session at our recent Innovative Libraries Online Conference, the ILOC conference, which was just held a week ago. And this has been archived as a recording, again available on our state library website. It's all about book banning. So he talks in here about more aspects of banned books or challenged books. And he includes some programming ideas as well as publicity and display ideas. So there you go, Zach. Good job. And I did watch the archived recording of it. I wasn't able to attend it on the day of the conference because I was hosting a different program in one of the other presentation rooms. But I did just recently watch it, Zach, and it was very good. So some good ideas there that are very complementary to what we're talking about here today. Now, in our remaining minutes, I want to cover an actual challenge. I told you in the publicity for this presentation that you would gain practical information about how to positively respond to a materials challenge. So let's do that right now. I'm going to give you a real-life scenario. This actually occurred here in Iowa. Now, when a book is challenged, as I said previously, that's known as a reconsideration because the library is going to reconsider whether or not to retain the item at the library. So here's the situation that happened here in Iowa. The library had this book titled The Notebook Girls, and it was shelved on the library's teen fiction shelf. And this book was written by 3 teen girls, obviously from the title, and they attended a somewhat affluent school in the New York area. The book is reportedly a remake of an actual notebook that the girls kept and forwarded among themselves during their high school years. In that notebook, as printed in this book, the girls wrote comments and concerns and quips. They often talked about topics that were very typical to teens, such as drugs and partying and sex. And the library had a parent complain. They complained about this book because this parent, it was a woman, she thought the language and the situations were vulgar. And so she filled out a reconsideration form that the library provided. Said she wanted the book completely removed from the library. Well, this library did have a reconsideration policy and a reconsideration form, so the library followed that policy. The policy said that a committee of 5 people, that included the library director, 2 trustees, and 2 community members, that those people on that committee would review the item in the reconsideration, in this case, this particular book you see here. The committee made a recommendation to the library board that they said they wanted to relocate the book from the teen fiction section to the adult nonfiction section. Keep in mind, this book really was nonfiction. It was not a fiction book. So the board moved to follow the committee's recommendation. They moved the book from the teen area to the adult area, from the teen fiction area to the adult nonfiction area. So I'm going to ask you, do you think that was an example of book banning? A few people are getting ready to type. Okay, Jill thinks it was an example of censorship. Christine says, oh, it was still there for them, presumably the teens, to read. Vicky says, no, they just moved it. Debbie says censorship, burying the book so people that it appeals to wouldn't find it. Oh, it looks like you're about half and half. What if I told you I only gave you part of the story? So let me share a few more details here. First of all, that scenario is my story. This is what happened to me when I was a library director. Now, I hope you know that by the time we've talked for over an hour now about intellectual freedom, I am a proponent of intellectual freedom. And I already mentioned about taking a whole class on intellectual freedom, and I previously presented these workshops on the importance of intellectual freedom and routinely taught it to PLM, PLS now. But here's what happened, the rest of the story. First of all, this incident was picked up by a local reporter. And this reporter happened to be new to the area, and seriously, I think she was out to get a promotion to the New York Times. She just really thought she was the reporter. She tried to push the envelope on this one and attempted to make a huge story out of it. And one thing she did was she nagged me, I mean nagged me, for the identity of the complainant. Now, if you remember about Iowa Code 22, which we looked at a little bit ago, I could not and should not have shared that information with the reporter because divulgence of the complainant's identity would have disclosed the materials this person had checked out for the library, right? And that's a violation of confidentiality, privacy. So I triple checked with ALA and I triple checked with my city attorney. I knew it was right. But this reporter did not like that I was not going to provide her with the complainant's name, and because of that, I really think she was out to get me. So secondly, as I mentioned, this book was incorrectly cataloged. The book was in the fiction section, the teen fiction section, and it's actually a nonfiction book. Now at that time, this library did not have a teen nonfiction section. So maybe that's why it ended up in the fiction section. And I will add that libraries routinely will recatalog books when they realize there's been an error in cataloging. So really, even if no one had challenged this book, it had been incorrectly cataloged and probably needed to be relocated anyway. But that's beside the point. So third, I did a lot of research on this book about how many libraries nationally own the book, about how many libraries in Iowa own the book. And Debbie, I will say yes, later the library did add a teen nonfiction section. It was kind of important that they did have that, but at the time they didn't. So anyway, I did this research about the book to find out the number of national libraries that owned it, how many Iowa libraries owned it, and how many of those Iowa libraries had the book, how they had classified it, how those Iowa libraries had classified it. So I think it was something like 45% had the book in the adult collections and 55% had it in teen collections. So it was kind of nearly half and half divided about where this book would go. So the point there is that having that particular book in the adult section was not uncommon. Third, I looked at the professional reviews about it. Or fourth, actually, I looked at the professional reviews. And School Library Journal recommended that the book was for high school and adult audiences, which was very interesting because this book was written by teens. And if you know anything about ALA's Young Adult Division, YALSA, they consider teens ages 12 to 18. And School Library Journal, instead of saying the book was recommended for teens, they said the book was recommended for high school. So obviously, high school and adults, they were obviously referring that this book was more appropriate for a slightly older audience, not maybe the 12 to 14 crowd. Additionally, recall that as one of you pointed out, in most of our libraries, and this was certainly the case at the library where I worked, anybody with a valid library card can check out any materials at any time. There were no ropes blocking certain aisles. There were no restrictions on what ages of patrons could check out what types of materials. So no matter where the book was located, anybody of any age could have checked it out. So next, the review committee included some parents who were parents of preteens and teens. And those people were so positively affected by this book. They felt it was valuable information that they wanted more parents to be able to read it, kind of as a primer to what high school students face. And so they really were kind of gung-ho about promoting access to the book, not denying it, which is interesting because that's not how the reporter interpreted all of this. So one of their main reasons for putting the book or recommending to move the book to the adult section was because they believed that teens would readily go to the adult section before adults would go to the teen section. So they were actually trying to promote the book and get more readership for it. And finally, the book was still retained by the library, ultimately. So maybe that has changed your perception a little bit about this whole story. Maybe not, but that's how things turned out. And as you know, as a director, you are subject to what your board says, right? So this is what happened. So here are some things that I did to handle this situation. The day after the board voted to accept the recommendation of the review committee, and that was to reclassify this book from teen fiction to adult nonfiction. And keep in mind, again, we did not have a teen nonfiction section, which was unfortunate because surely that's where it would have ended up going. But they wanted it in the nonfiction section, and the only option then was the adults. But this news reporter, boy, she had her story ready. And she presented it in such a way as to make it sound like the board had actually banned the book. And she really presented the story with only some partial information. She failed to include this additional information that I just shared with you on that past slide. So needless to say, I was extremely frustrated with this reporter, and the online version of the story that this reporter wrote had some people accusing the board of censorship. So I immediately got to work remedying the situation. I had already established a Google Alerts, and if you've not done this for your library, I would encourage you to do this. You can do a Google search for Google Alerts, and it will tell you how to do that. And basically what this did is it would send me notices via email anytime my library's name was mentioned online in any way. So that helped me know what was being said about our library. The next thing that I did was I responded very quickly. I immediately posted to that reply, as a reply to that online story, the rest of the story that included a lot of information about how the board had thoughtfully made their decision and why. And that information then put a stop to the naysayers. I composed a succinct yet very informative letter to the editor, mailed it the following day, and the paper did publish that. I posted information to a blog that I used to maintain. And a few days later, through Google Alerts, I realized that ALA had picked up the story about our challenge, and all they had done was cut and paste that poorly reported story from the reporter. I was really disappointed. So I immediately went all the way to the top. I contacted the American Library Association and told them that as a long-time card-carrying, dues-paying ALA member, I was disappointed in what they had done, that they had believed this one poorly reported story and had not bothered to check with the library for information or to hear our side of it. So lo and behold, ALA did a whole interview with me. I wrote a pretty big article about it, which they published online as well as in a print publication. Very positive story where they admitted, hey, we really didn't have the whole story here, and we're glad to hear this worked out the way it did. So really what we got from my library was some positive national publicity out of the deal. I also had the chair of the Iowa Library Association, the chair at that time, the chair of the ILA's Intellectual Freedom Committee contact me and commend me for rightly handling what was otherwise a sticky situation. And yet a few days later, just completely out of the blue, I was so caught off guard. One of the authors of the book called me, and she said, hey, I just want to thank you for sticking up for our book. She said a lot of libraries had completely pulled it off the shelf, but you obviously kept it and stood up for it. And she had seen our story online, the positive one from ALA. So that was pretty amazing that the author contacted me. I wish I'd been a little bit more prepared because I can't remember what I said. I think I kind of just went, or something totally incoherent like that. So finally, after a while, my best tip to use if this happens is you just have to let it rest. I stopped worrying. I had had so many sleepless nights over this issue. I had to resign myself to the fact that I had acted appropriately as a librarian. I believed I had stood up for intellectual freedom. I believed that my review committee and my board had made a very careful and thoughtful decision and that their intent was to promote the book. And I just had to let it rest and kind of rejoice in those victories of the positive information about my library that was dispelled by ALA and the fact that the author contacted me and was happy about it. So my tips for you, if you have a challenge, how you can respond. Number one is be prepared. I think a lot of challenges can be avoided if we appropriately catalog and shelve our materials. Hopefully you've got your children's videos separated from your adult videos. Hopefully your parents understand that your children's collection covers ages from 0 to 12, but that within that area you've got the books designed for little bitty kids, your board books, your emergent reader books, followed by your picture books, followed by your juvenile fiction and nonfiction, that it's progressive. If you explain that to parents who might complain about a book you've got in the children's area, well, this collection is for ages 0 to 12, and since your little child is only 3, I recommend you focus on these shelves over here, which is designed for the younger readers. Sometimes that can really help dispel a parent's negative comments. Be polite. It never does any good to yell and rant and be nasty to people. Just remember that censorship is a two-way street. If you're trying to quiet the censor, you're censoring the censor. Be informed. Learn about books that are potential for challenges. Read reviews. Know what the books are about. Do those Google alerts so you know what's happening whenever your library is in the news and being mentioned somewhere. If you have a challenge, immediately notify your board and your staff, and perhaps refer the staff that if any news reporter comes in, that they should refer that reporter to you, unless you have another person that you would designate as a spokesperson. Respond quickly, as I did when I had to write the letters to the editor. Maintain files of your challenges, because most of your libraries will probably have in the policies that you'll only accept a challenge to an item once per year or once every 3 years or something like that. So maintain files so you know what was done. And be sure to contact your district consultant or the Iowa Library Association for assistance, because we're here to help you. Your reconsideration policy hopefully has information about what needs to be done, and most of you probably have something like what's underneath this box that says for a request to be considered, the form has to be completed in full. This was the form from Waukee. Basically, it's got 8 questions on it. It asks, you can see about 3 or 4, a couple of them on here. Going on, it says, what do you feel might be the result of exposure to this item? For what age group would you recommend the item? Did you read, view, or hear the entire material? Because that's what a lot of people do. They only pick out page 47 where the dirty part is, and that's all they see. Are you aware of the judgment of this material by professional critics? Have you seen or heard reviews of this item? And what would you like the library to do with this item? The form then asks for the complainant's name and signature and date. So sometimes if you have somebody come up to the front desk and start ranting about an item and asking you to remove it, sometimes if you present this form and explain what your library's policies are in a polite way, as Vicki says, it's hard to fight kindness. Be kind and polite and listen. Sometimes that's all the person wants. And a lot of times when people realize they have to fill out this request and it's going to be a process of some sort, they will back off. Sometimes people just want to be heard. So this is sort of an aside, but I want to mention in this presentation that Pella has a policy about confidentiality and tying in with their board, which I thought was interesting. The freedom to read statement, we've already mentioned some of these. There's also a freedom to view statement, and we are running out of time. So I'm going to quickly move on. I'm surprised no one's really mentioned this. Well, I think one of you did mention pornography earlier. This was an article out of 2011 from the New York Public Library where they actually declared that pornography was protected speech. Now I'm going to share with you information from Mandy, and she does briefly touch on this on that webinar that I mentioned previously that's on our archive about the problem parents and unattended children. But according to Mandy, child pornography is illegal. Nobody should be allowed to view that at your library. According to Mandy, adults viewing porn is not illegal. That's true, it's not illegal. But if somebody else complains, then the library can and should intervene. Librarians should not be monitoring what patrons are viewing, and she says it's a good idea if you have separate areas for your children's and adults' computers. So as I said previously, balance is really the key to almost all of librarianship. And you need to have policies. One of you said no porn's allowed because it's in our policy. You need to make sure you've got good policies, and maybe even have your attorneys look at that, your city attorney look at some of your policies if you have questions as to whether or not it will hold in a court of law. This one is coming out of Pella. That's because of the internet. This is their computer internet use policy, and by the way, that's another required policy for your accreditation, that they don't take responsibility for what's displayed through the internet. But tied in with that, they don't allow illegal actions on their computers. And they say exposing patrons or staff to offensive images or languages is not allowed in the library. And Melissa, that's interesting, and I'm going to defer you to some legal resources about that. One, in the essence of time, and two, because I'm not an attorney. but I will say that you need to have good policies, and I would probably vet them with your attorney. Iowa Code about obscenity, this is what it says. Guilty of public offense if you're displaying or dissemination exhibit of obscene material. So that's something to think about as far as, well, can children see what these people are viewing? Then that kind of lends a new slant to it. Now there is an exemption lest you're worried that a young child will access some of your art books that have nudity in them. Public libraries are exempt about exhibition and display of artworks used in materials in a public library. The definition of obscenity is included in Iowa's definition, but it's pretty vague, and attorneys will tell you it's difficult to define. So for librarians to try to determine what's obscene and what's not, it's probably an area you don't want to attempt, and I imagine Mandy would tell you that as well. Again, talk with the state law library if you have questions, or consult your city attorney if you want legal advice in this issue, but definitely think about your policies. There are some toolkits available from both the American Library Association and the Iowa Library Association that deal with intellectual freedom, and we can make these slides available later, so you'll have these links. If you have additional questions, there are resources on our state library website all about intellectual freedom. And don't forget about your district consultant, the state law library, your city attorney, as I've mentioned. Questions. We're right at the end point. I would say please send your questions to me and I will address them, or tell you, I think this is one for your attorney. Sorry I couldn't keep up with the chat. You were just a fantastic audience today. I loved all the chat, and I'm sure all of you benefited from it as well. I will definitely go back in the recording and view the chats, and if I see something, a question maybe that I missed, I will contact you and provide an answer. Or as I said, feel free to contact me here with any of your questions or concerns or comments. So I'm glad you appreciated this information. I hope you found it useful. As I said, we have recorded it, and it will be available on the State Library's website under the archived webinars. So perhaps this is something you can share with other staff or with your board. Jay, thank you so much for being here today, and thanks to all of you. Enjoy the rest of your day.